Welcome to the workshop we're going to have over the next few days. It's good to see lots of old friends, and hopefully we'll make some new ones. One of the things that I want to emphasize for this workshop, we have some big questions, lots of big questions, lots of deep questions. And so in addition to the various formal presentations that we'll have over the next couple days, we have lots of time for discussion during the sessions and also between the sessions. So I hope we'll take advantage of that. So for instance, this evening there is a reception, 4:30 to 6. Should be lots of nice food and drink for that. And also tomorrow a poster session in the afternoon that also doubles as a reception. And a poster blitz starting at 4:40, the poster blitz being the opportunity for each of the poster presenters to talk about their poster for, what did we tell you, a minute and a half, something like this? But basically get up and just say, hey, this is my poster, it's awesome, come see it. Those are always fun, so please show up for that. On Sunday, there are breakout sessions where we'll be assigning you questions to discuss, and then you'll report back in a plenary session. We'll say more about that when we get to it on Sunday, but notice on your badge you have a colored dot. That sorts you into breakout session rooms, right? So there'll be a blue room, a yellow room, and a something else room. Good, so that's what I want to say just in terms of introduction for the events over the next couple of days. Introductions of me, I'm Mike Anderson. I'm at least partially responsible for this event, for better or for worse. Also assisted by Tim Bain, we want to wave Tim, Jackie Sullivan over here, and then various students. Daniel Booth, where's Daniel? Say hi. You've probably met some of them at the reception, I guess. Tracy DeBoer is over here, Jacqueline Lanthier here, and Mary Stevenson. And then staff, Deborah Fox, is she here? Okay, and Rob, I didn't see Rob here, and Carol Suter is, okay, well, so, yeah, those are working. Anyway, those are the folks, we're the folks that if you have any issues or questions, come grab one of us and we'll do what we can to help out. Okay, on to more substantive things. One of the first things that I want to say about this notion of rethinking the taxonomy of psychology is that it's not whether we should do it or whether we are doing it, but why we should be doing it. We should think about why we're doing it, what the purpose of doing it is, and how we should do it. Because every time, for instance, we went from revising the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in psychiatry, that was an exercise in rethinking the taxonomy of psychology, in rethinking the way that we categorize mental disorders, mental disease, and normal functioning. And it's gotten sort of more interesting lately. Oh, if that's controversial enough, right? You probably are aware. It's gotten more interesting lately because now, with the DSM-5, we've got that versus something called RDoC. This is the initiative of the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health. They don't like DSM for various reasons. And so they are proposing their own different way of thinking about mental function and mental disorder. One of the distinctive features of RDoC, and I'll say more about this, and I know we're going to hear a lot more about this over the next few days, is that it's explicitly meant to be integrative at multiple scales, right? So genetic, neural, behavioral, right, social, which is not the case with DSM, for instance, right? And so there are issues then that arise in thinking about what kind of taxonomy you're going to get in a framework like RDoC, which is explicitly, I mean, it's actually fairly neurocentric, even though they deny that. We'll hear more about that over the next few days. And it's different from the kind of thing you get in a DSM-style formalism. And of course, what happens in psychiatry or clinical psychology also happens, of course, in experimental psychology. Right? It's been happening over the past 100 or more years as we've gone through various kinds of thinking about what the mind is, how to understand behavior. Each of those changes was accompanied by, or had as part of it, a change in the taxonomy of psychology, the underlying vocabulary or set of concepts we use to understand mind, brain, and behavior. This is one of my favorite exercises in ridicule. This comes from Russ Poldrack. He's coming tomorrow. You'll hear more about this kind of thing from him, I believe. But what he did was he said, hey, look, what if fMRI were invented in the time of phrenology? And what if we put people in the scanner and ask them in experimental settings that use the concepts of phrenology? He says, guess what? We would see differential function because that's what the brain does. It responds differentially to no matter what you do to it. So he says, look, we have impulse to propagation or tenderness for the offspring or parental love, friendly attachment or fidelity, valor and self-defense. And then, because Russ is this way, he actually maps those onto actual fMRI experiments, no doubt pissing off their authors, but I think making a very interesting and potentially even deep point, which is really how different is activation for judgment about self versus others from the category of ambition or vanity that we get out of the phrenological literature. And if they are different, on what basis can we say they're different? It's also clearly a fairly corrosive thought, right? Do we really know what the underlying basis for our psychological distinctions is? Have we hit on the right set of those categories? And wouldn't it be kind of miraculous if we had? And so in that kind of context, the question is, so where do we go from there? And I hope we'll hear some good answers to that question over the next few days. There's also something very important that I think is happening right now over the last decade or maybe slightly more. It's something at the Rotman Institute we've taken to calling the brain boom. And by the way, let me pause to point out for those of you who are local, this is one, but there are going to be several events over the next year on this theme, sponsored by the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. So keep an eye out for that. So the brain boom being basically the notion that neuroscience has not only gotten a lot more attention, has made a lot of progress, but has now started to affect the lives of our lives in many, 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 many different ways and in many, many, many different venues, right? So we have not just cognitive neuroscience, but we've got neurophilosophy, we've got neuroeconomics, we've got people wondering if you can use fMRI for lie detectors. You can't, don't worry. We've got people wondering about, in general though, the use of fMRI and other neuroimaging techniques in the courtroom. We've got, obviously also, as I already mentioned, neuroscience really making a push to change psychology in various ways. So this is the criteria for inclusion as a category of mental disorder in the R-dot classification, right? Evidence for a functional behavioral or psychological construct, evidence for a neural system or circuit that plays a major role in implementing that function, and a putative relationship to some clinically significant problem or symptom. So if you don't have a brain mapping for your category, it doesn't count and you can't get funding for it. That's a big stick to be using to push the taxonomy of psychology around. Right? There are a huge number of questions that arise as a result of that, not just scientific, but also social. And again, that's in clinical psychology, but there's also been a kind of a neurocentric turn in experimental psychology, and I think a very interesting one. Because generally, up till now, or up till recently, we've thought of psychological experiments as a way to get a window onto the brain, right, to understand brain function. But recently, we've flipped that. And now we're using the brain as a window onto our psychological constructs. And it's a very interesting new development that deserves some attention and reflection. I want to give you just one example. This is a study from a few years ago by Lunarowicz and others. And they did a meta-analysis of hundreds of neuroimaging experiments purporting to investigate the components of cognitive control. So that's things like working memory, response selection, response inhibition, task switching, et cetera, right? So what are all the sub-functions that go under the heading of cognitive control? And they said, is there a neural signature for each of these things? They did that by performing a so-called discriminability analysis, the details of which don't really matter. But the idea was, in each of these conditions, let's look at the patterns of brain activation that we observe, and we'll see if they're actually different from one another. here's, again, the details don't much matter here, but here's, roughly speaking, what that looks like. So each of these things is a pattern of brain activation under these various constructs, right? So that's working memory, task switching, response selection, response inhibition, cognitive control in general, and then bilingualism just as a control condition on the bottom there. And these numbers represent the ability to tell the difference between each of these constructs based on the pattern of brain activity. The one I want you to pay attention to are the two under TS. You see a 0.49 and a 0.47. In other words, you're at 50-50 discriminating task switching from response selection and response inhibition. Right, so you can't tell. There is not a brain signature, according to this analysis, there's not a brain signature for task switching. So they ask, provocatively and interestingly, is there such a thing as task switching? Not that we don't switch tasks, right? Clearly we switch tasks. But there's no psychological, there's no underlying psychological sameness between all the different instances of us switching tasks. Or at least that's one way to understand what it is that they show when you see that you can't tell the difference between the brain patterns observed under these various conditions. Right? So here again, this is cognitive psychology, as many of you will be aware, which has its roots in the so-called cognitive revolution, driven by computational theories in the 50s. Cognitive psychology was born to explicitly be independent from neuroscience. Right? It was intended to be an autonomous science with its own methods and own grounding. This is clearly a pretty significant encroachment on that autonomy. And again, the question is that a good thing? Should we keep doing that? Is this likely to lead to actual scientific progress? And there's probably many more questions besides. There are even more radical possibilities. I'm not going to show you those because I think we're going to hear about them over the next few days. But let me just say, in addition to doing things like saying, hey, is there a neural reality underneath our various constructs? It's possible using these techniques to also come up with new constructs. And we have to ask again what utility that's going to be and so on. We can talk lots more about that as we see more of the presentations. One example of this we're going to hear about in about a half an hour from Kristen Lindquist and others who are indeed thinking, in their case, about emotion and how to use the brain to re-understand the nature of emotion. Right? Which I like this because emotion, it seems like such a phenomenological thing that you better be getting at it phenomenologically, right? Emotions are feelings, after all. But here they're saying, no, actually, you're mistaken about that. And the brain can do a much better job at sorting these things out than you can. And they position themselves, I hope you're not going to be showing the same stuff. Good. They position themselves as part of an evolution in psychology and the relationship between psychology and neuroscience, where you have these nice, neat one-to-one mappings between psychological constructs and parts of the brain, right? You have simple dedication of parts of the brain to very distinct psychological constructs. And they say instead we want to do something way more complicated than that, right? Where we have various networks of the brain. Again, we're going to hear quite a bit about that from Randy McIntosh in a little bit. And those networks of the brain have particular functions, but those various kinds of functions get used and reused across multiple different kinds of behaviors. And the suggestion is that means we really have to understand differently than we do now the nature of those behaviors. So the point of this very, very brief and simple introduction is to make the point that there are many interesting developments, but especially many, many, many open questions. Right? What is the status of our current psychological concepts? How confident should we be in them? Right? Under what circumstances can we be confident? And a sub-question under there is, are categories or faculties even appropriate in psychology? right? Should we be making categorical distinctions between things? Or should we think about things, I don't know, in a different way, along psychological dimensions, for instance? If we do come up over the next decades with a new set of concepts, a new set of psychological primitives, what should they look like? Right? How phenomenologically based should they be? How semantically interpretable do they need to be? I mean, we can do maybe dynamic modeling is a better way to understand this, even though the innards of the dynamic model wouldn't necessarily be semantically interpretable, but they might still be really useful for doing things like predicting behavior. They might be really useful for doing things like designing workspaces that are effective, even if we didn't really understand how the dynamical model mapped onto a phenomenology. How different will or could any new concept we come up with be from current notions? Or that is, in other words, how trapped do we think we are, right, in our current way of thinking, and how far away from that could we possibly get? Is there going to be an unified set? Or will there be multiple overlapping or even incompatible sets that are useful in various circumstances? What would the criteria for inclusion in any taxonomy be? How could it be evaluated? What would be a good one versus a less good one? One of the things that I really like about working at the intersection of neuroscience and psychology and philosophy at this juncture in history is that everything is up in the air, which is either awesome or terrible, depending on how you, right, depending on your attitude towards it. I think it's awesome. I think it's a very exciting time to be working in this area. And this is only one of the ways of understanding the kind of potential that we have for moving forward and reshaping the sciences of the mind in light of findings in neuroscience, in light of new techniques in computer science, in light of better ways of understanding and measuring behavior and more besides. More questions. If we come up with some new set of primitives, what's going to be the mapping, the nature of the mapping between those primitives and the brain? Is it going to be one-to-one? Is it always going to be many-to-many? Do we want one over the other? Is one better? What, again, is the proper relationship between neuroscience and psychology? Should they be autonomous? Right? Do they have their own spheres within science, and right, so that they wouldn't necessarily need to be incompatible, but maybe they also shouldn't necessarily be, as it were, pushing one another around. And finally, for just this set of questions, what's the likely effect of all this on folk psychology, right, on our self-understanding? One simple example that I like to use, this comes out of work from my own lab. We tend to think of humor as an emotional experience. And in fact, in the brain map taxonomy, which is a big repository of neuroimaging experiments categorized in various ways, in that repository, humor is indeed a subcategory of emotion. However, when you do one of those analyses, discriminability analyses, on the activations that you can find, a meta-analysis of activations and patterns of brain activity that you can find in databases like BrainMap, what you find is that the patterns of brain activity during emotion tasks, during humor tasks, look virtually nothing like the other ones in the rest of the emotional categories. And they look a lot more like the patterns you see under semantics. And this is true even though the stimuli aren't just jokes, which would make sense, right? That's clearly semantic involvement, but even things like funny cat videos, right? So yes, humor is an emotional experience, I guess, but according to the brain, it's a lot more like language. And should that lead us to question our own categorization of humor as an emotional process? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting question to be asking. And you can sort of repeat that question for other kinds of folk psychological categories. And as I think we're going to hear a little bit about in Kristen Lindquist's talk, for things that are phenomenologically, as it were, very close to us, like emotion. And the other thing I want to point out is, I don't know everybody in this room, but I know a number of people in this room. We are bringing to this question over the next few days many different perspectives, and that's really important. And I want us to be aware of that, and I want us to take advantage of that. So that we have philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, sociologists, historians, and others in this room. We all know a lot of things, and we all know not a lot of different things. And I'm really very much looking forward to learning from you all, and I hope that you all are looking forward to learning from one another. As I say, this has been a brief introduction. I've written some stuff on this topic. If you're interested in my more detailed perspectives, here are two possible places to look. A book that I had come out about a year and a half ago, and then a recent article in Philosophy Compass about this very issue called Mining the Brain for a New Taxonomy of the Mind. So if you're interested, please look those things up. And that's pretty much all I have to say. We have Christian Lindquist coming up at 11 o'clock. So if you have any questions right now, I'm happy to entertain them. Otherwise, you can get a top up on your coffee, have a chat, and come back here in about 20 minutes. Thanks.